In the founding story of this congregation, the First Unitarian Church of Wilmington, we say that it came into existence when a group of liberal Christians had conversations about religion and how their understanding of faith could influence their lives. Those conversations led to the decision of the group to establish our church, the First Unitarian Church of Wilmington, Delaware. In February 1866, the first document stated, "The undersigned propose to associate themselves for the purpose of forming and sustaining in the city of Wilmington a society of the Unitarian faith, and to take the earliest practical measures therefore." That's how they spoke back then. But what really stands out for me is that date. That date. What was the date? Right. It has always struck me that this congregation had its formation during such a critical time in this nation's history. This period of our congregation's founding coincides with the end of the Civil War, the beginning of the so-called Reconstruction period, and a period of both victory and turmoil, peace and upheaval. I have wondered, what was it like for our ancestors to gather congregation during a time when collective grief and trauma from the Civil War had to still be present? What was it like when the freedom from slavery came to those of African descent and a process of so-called Reconstruction was underway to establish equity and parity for people formerly held as slaves? And it was just the beginning of that process. What was it like for our ancestors to start a church in 18 at a time when the government was in disarray following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865? What was it like? What did it take for a group of people to start a church then, at that juncture in history? How was it to be gathering a congregation when in 1866 Congress passed the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights Bill? The first bill extended the life of an agency Congress had created in 1865 to oversee this transition from slavery to freedom. And the second bill, the Civil Rights Bill, defined all persons born in the United States as national citizens who were to enjoy equality before the law. And then, subsequently, Southern states were given under President Johnson the right to form their own laws and eventually began to deviate from the promises of the Reconstruction. Our ancestors decided to carry forward the promise of the liberal Christianity of their time, the Unitarian faith of their time that held that humans were not innately deprived, that all were children of God and deserved the respect and the dignity of being human, that we could bring about our own salvation through inner work and caring action in the world, that there was a distinction between the religion about Jesus as taught in other Christian churches, and the religion of Jesus, which imagined that Jesus' moral character was available to all of us. And what was it like to have that faith that what we brought about in this world, in the here and now, was as important, if not more so, than whatever happened in the hereafter? It may not seem like such a big deal to us sophisticated, rational, intellectual, Unitarian Universalists today, but it was a big deal then. to establish such an optimistic faith in a time when upheavals were still settling down and still rising up in spite of it all. This is the heritage that the ancestors of this congregation have passed on to us. And I want to honor that spirit that infused us from our very beginning. It was during this time. What was the founding date of the church? Okay, great. Okay. It was during this time that Ida B. Wells, who has inspired my focus with you this morning, was just beginning her own life and work. I came to first know of her from a friend, a Unitarian Universalist colleague, Reverend Carlton Elliott Smith, who actually grew up in Holly Springs, Mississippi, where Wells was born. Books about her were not available in my elementary school library. Anyone here ever read a book about her early on in their lives? There are reasons for that I'll get to. I have come to appreciate that her life and work deserves more recognition now and can be an exemplar, and that she can be an exemplar for us in these times in which we live. And some have actually called her a prophet for our time. Ida Wells was born in 1862 into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi. And when freedom came in 1865, her father was instrumental in establishing a school for African American kids in Holly Springs, and Ida would attend that school. Ida Wells grew and matured during this time following the Civil War, during the Reconstruction, when at last the promise of equity and parity for people of African descent would seem to be realized. Yet, there would be events that would dash these hopes. Again and again, Ida Wells would encounter the gap between the promise and the reality. Again and again, Ida Wells would experience how the system could conspire against the promise and the hope of equity and freedom. It was in these tensions that Ida Wells' life would be formed, where she would find her voice as an African-American woman and a relentless journalist, and become an inspiration and advocate for justice as she called out the horrific continuation of the denigration and the outright death of those of African descent in post-Civil War America. Reconstruction and post-construction period of the American South, these events were happening, and she put a spotlight on them. When it was declared in the 1876 presidential election that no candidate received a majority of the electoral votes, hold on as I take a breath here. A 15-member commission decided who the president would be. It was then that Ruth Rutherford Hayes was chosen as president, and I quote, by promising to withdraw the remaining federal troops from the South that were sent there to reinforce the laws and the practices of Reconstruction. What happened was the beginning of what some writers have called neo-slavery. And by 1890, many laws limiting the voting rights and freedoms of those of African descent eventually became codified in what we have known to be called the Jim Crow laws, which were in effect until our modern civil rights movements in the 1960s. So what became of the promise and the hope for those who had been enslaved gradually reverted back to restriction and racism? Ida B. Wells personally experienced this transition towards freedom and dignity and its gradual reversal. What was it? What was it that formed this relentless spirit and this prophetic voice that would become Ida B. Wells? As I explore this question with you this morning, rather than focus just on the facts of her life, the surface of her life, I want to invite us into a dialogue with her life. I want us to recognize that however different or distant we may be from her experience and her historical moment, that there is something available to her inner life that can also guide us, whoever we are, whatever time we are in. Moreover, given the time that we are in, I want to invite us into finding what wisdom and inquiry she leads us to in our time, which requires us to show up, which requires us to, I knew you'd get it, requires us to show up again and again and again. When her parents both died from the yellow fever epidemic, Ida B. Wells took over the support of her siblings as a mere 16-year-old child. She convinced her extended family that it would be best if all the siblings would stay together, and somehow or another they agreed to let her be in charge. This eventually necessitated Wells' move to Memphis, Tennessee for a teaching job. Now, just among us, she lied about her age so she could get the position. There must have been something convincing about her presence. This trip to Memphis led to a defining and unexpected moment in her own life. I will call this moment an open moment. They occur in each of our lives, open moments when we have a choice to hear the deep call within, open moments when we have a choice to respond to the deep call within us. When Wells rode that train to Memphis for her teaching job, it was on one of these trains that the incident happened where she was ordered to move to the, quote, black car, and then she was thrown off the car when she refused to do so. Now, Wells could have just left it at that. She could have just succumbed to the narrative or the reality of her time that things like this happen to black people. Instead, she tapped into an inner strength and conviction that was stronger than convention. She sued the train company, and behold, the judge ruled in her favor. This is a chance for us to applaud, However, subsequently, this decision was appealed and then overturned when it went to the Tennessee Supreme Court. This overturning of the decision in favor of racial discrimination, remember, we are talking about being thrown off of a train here. This was a defining moment for her. This was an open moment in which she could dare to hear the call and dare to respond. Ida B. Wells looked beyond the incident to a larger implications, and she didn't brush off the defeat and then retreat. Beyond the external event was the meaning of the broader meaning of that singular event. Ida B. Wells continued to awaken and to call others to the awakening of the gap between the promise and the reality, between law and the upholding of those laws, between espoused justice and the cruel usurpation of that justice in the everyday experiences of those who knew about justice denied. She called for a boycott. She wrote about her experiences in her own paper, The Free Speech. So having heard this much about Ida B. Wells, having come this far in her narrative, let's see what wisdom we might be able to draw so far from the story, the surface of her life, for our own lives as well. So friends, how do we cultivate that vision in us that can see not just an isolated incident of injustice, but the broader meaning and the implications of just a singular incident? How do we have that kind of perception? What is it that keeps us engaged in the work of justice and equity, even when we experience an apparent defeat? What strengths of spirit do we draw upon that keep us relentlessly engaged rather than gradually retreat? These might just be rhetorical questions that Reverend Larry is asking us right now. He doesn't really mean for us to spend time to think about this, does he? Yes, he does. He does. And we can't necessarily think about it all right now in this moment, but I ask you to ponder these questions as we have the continual dialogue with Ida B. Wells's life. These are among the questions that could prompt us into that dialogue with this open moment in Ida B. Wells's life, but also the open moment within our own life as well. Now, the next big tragic event that propelled Ida Wells into becoming a voice and an advocate for justice occurred in Memphis in March 1892. 3 men she knew were lynched. In fact, she was the godmother of the daughter of one of the men, Tom Moss. What was the crime that these 3 men, I need to quote from a book by Ida B. Wells, a book entitled Passionate for Justice, to convey to you what may otherwise seem unfathomable. So I quote, "The 3 African Americans were running a successful grocery store in competition with a white-owned store across the street in a black neighborhood. The owner of the white store gathered a mob to attack their rival store, and the African Americans returned fire when they were attacked. 3 white men were wounded, but none were killed. 31 African Americans were arrested, but later they were all removed from the jail by masked raiders. 3 of them, including Ida Wells' good friend Tom Moss, were executed by lynching." Again, in this defining and open moment in her life, she decided to respond. In fact, her investigative journalism became well known and respected, and is still a legacy that contemporary journalists still learn from. She began a study of 728 lynchings over the previous 10 years, and she used white newspapers as her primary sources, and her findings were astonishing to all. In May 1892, she wrote about these lynchings and published a blistering editorial about the real purpose for lynching black people. Most upsetting to some was her implication that some of the liaisons between black men and white women were consensual and not rape. That was hard for some to understand at the time. After this issue of Free Speech paper came out, her offices were burned to the ground. She learned about this while on a trip to New York, and knowing that her own life was threatened, she never returned to the South until 30 years later in 1922. So think about that. Think about that disruption. Think about the cost that came from her responding to that open moment and deciding to respond to the call rather than to retreat from it. In spite of the threats and the losses that she experienced, she became a leading national advocate of anti-lynching. She even went to England, which did a lot of cotton business with the South. And she shared these stories. And she had personal meetings with many in the government. And she wrote articles for their newspapers to expose this truth. Keep in mind, she was writing for those who did not know what was occurring, so that they would. So our dialogue with her life has to include these questions that take us into our time. What are the voices and the experiences that must be heard now? How do our current practices of journalism serve the path of justice or distract us from it? At an inner level, what have been the events in our own lives that may not be as tragic as those that Ida Wells experienced, but have also propelled us into giving voice to what otherwise might not be more fully known? And where does that strength come from within you that strengthens and cultivates courage and relentlessness in the face of injustice? Ida B. Wells also addressed the women's issues of her time. She was active in the women's suffragist movement. She started women's clubs all over the country to mobilize women to work for equity in the local, the state, and the national level. She also started the National Conference of Colored Women and was joined by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a member of the Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, and Harriet Tubman, who together fought to struggle against the reinstatement of neo-slavery under Jim Crow, what one author calls slavery by another name. Now, later in her life in Wilmington, North Carolina, when white citizens staged a coup d'etat that overcame the legitimately elected black city government, killing many black citizens in the process, Ida Wells appealed to William McKinley to intercede, but he refused. So she wrote about it. She talked about it. She told the story. Her perceived radicalism did not win favor among some other black leaders who at the time didn't want to upset things too much, particularly with those who were in power, those they were trying to persuade. And then Ida B. Wells did return to the South in January 1922 to visit 12 African-American men who had been arrested and accused of murder in a riot that history shows were actually started by, quote, white marauders. She disguised herself as a cousin of one of the men in order to protect herself by being recognized. Did I tell you she was only 5 feet tall? She may seem like a giant from what I've been saying about her. And after talking to the men in the jail and listening to their stories, after taking many notes, she listened as they sang some spirituals. And then she did some reconstruction of Christian theology right on the spot. She said, "I've been listening to you for nearly 2 hours. You've talked and sang and prayed about dying and forgiving your enemies and of feeling sure that you're going to be received in the New Jerusalem, heaven, because your God knows that you are innocent of the offense for which you expect to be electrocuted. But why don't you pray to live and ask to be freed?" She said to them, "The God you serve is the God of Paul and Silas who opened their prison gates. And if you have all the faith you say you have, you ought to believe that he will open your prison doors too. Quit talking about dying," she said. "If you believe your God is all powerful and believe that he is powerful enough to open these prison doors, then say so." Turns out she was very prophetic. Because, as it turns out, this case, Moore versus Dempsey, was the first case in the 20th century to be considered by the Supreme Court focusing on the rights of African Americans in the South in criminal matters. And eventually, the 12 were freed because it was recognized that their constitutional rights had been denied. So, as you can see, Ida Wells was a mighty voice for justice, for the rights of women and the rights of the poor. She was able to see how the gaps between the espoused values and the actual experience that she was able to see those gaps that many ignored. She was able to see the systems that upheld neo-slavery of her time and the continual denial of the death of African Americans through injustice. She spoke truth to power even when her voice was considered too radical or that it might upset even some of those who served in coalitions with her. Hers was a faith that believed it was important to have faith in the here and now. Liberation now, release from the prison gates, literal or systemic, gates that suppress the dignity of others. And now is the open moment. Now is our own moment to decide what are the ways that we can carry forward the legacy of Ida B. Wells as a truth teller and a justice seeker. What are the ways that we can tap into our own individual and collective calls to be and to do what we are called to do as we listen deeply to our own time? What are the ways that we can carry forward the legacy of First Unitarian Church of Wilmington and can dare to continue to be a beacon for all humanity, even when for some despair threatens to extinguish hope, even when overwhelm for some lures them towards retreat. I couldn't help but finish this sermon and listen to a song, one of my favorite songs in ragtime. If you know what stirs your preacher's spirit every now and then, that Aretha Franklin version of the ragtime Make Them Hear You song is so stirring. I won't sing it. But I want to close with just this verse from the song. Make them hear you, make them hear you. Your sword can be a sermon or the power of the pen. Teach every child to raise his voice, and then, my brothers, then will justice be demanded by 10 million righteous ones. Make them hear you. And when they hear you, I'll be near you. And I sensed Ida B. Wells' spirit when I heard that particular verse. I'll be near you.